The summer heat of 1851 burned across the eastern stretch of Texas, and with it came a darkness that would be whispered about in hushed tones for generations to come. Across 3 counties, Harrison, Cherokee, and the lands between, a pattern began to emerge that defied all logic, all reason, all natural law. 7 plantation owners, 7 men of wealth and standing, and within 18 short months, every single one of them would be dead. But here's what made their deaths truly haunting. Each of these men had made the same purchase. Each had acquired the same human being as property. And each met their end mere weeks after signing those papers. When the county officials recorded these deaths in their leather-bound ledgers, they used identical words every time. Sudden failure of constitution. 3 words that buried far more than bodies. What they were really burying was a truth so unsettling, so profoundly disturbing, that it would remain locked away in courthouse cellars until time itself erased the buildings that held those secrets. The man at the center of this mystery never once lifted a blade, never slipped poison into a well, never left behind a single mark that could tie him to anything. And yet, he eliminated those who claimed ownership over him with a surgical precision that transformed him into something the entire slave system had never before witnessed, a man who simply could not be owned. But before we dive deeper into the story of Samuel Kincaid, the only enslaved man who passed through 7 different plantations and left 7 grieving widows in his wake, I need you to do something right this moment. Hit that subscribe button, because the sealed room brings you the hidden chapters of American history, the ones that never made it into your textbooks, the ones that reveal truths too uncomfortable to teach. And drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from. Which state, which city, because this story reaches into every corner of the American South, and I want to know exactly where you're standing when you hear what Samuel truly accomplished, the man who would eventually be known only in whispers as the Widowmaker. He first appeared in the town of Marshall, Texas on a spring day in 1850 during the cotton auction season. Though if you tried to trace his origins through the bills of sale, you'd find yourself lost in a maze of contradictions. 3 different states listed as his birthplace. 4 different ages recorded. The paperwork seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. Marshall itself sat at a crossroads of everything that made antebellum Texas both prosperous and perpetually anxious. As the county seat of Harrison County, it functioned as the final significant waypoint before the Louisiana border, where cotton, timber, and human lives moved along routes that fed the insatiable markets of New Orleans. The year 1850 found the town growing wealthy on cotton money. Brick buildings were rising where wooden structures once stood. Plantation houses spread across the piney woods like marble monuments honoring King Cotton. The Caddo Lake region offered access to waterways. The earth ran deep with moisture-holding clay that could withstand even the most brutal summer heat. And whispers spoke of a railroad coming, though that iron track wouldn't arrive until after the war had already changed everything forever. Marshall's white population numbered somewhere around 2,000 souls. Another 3,000 people, enslaved people, labored on the plantations that encircled the town. The social hierarchy operated with the rigid structure of religious doctrine. At the very top sat the old Texas families, those whose blood had been spilled in the Revolution. Below them came the transplants from Georgia and Carolina, bringing both their slaves and their knowledge of cotton cultivation. Then the land speculators and the overseers. Below them, poor white families who possessed nothing except the color of their skin. And at the absolute bottom, the enslaved who by law owned nothing at all, not even themselves. Into this carefully ordered world walked Thomas Caffrey, a second-generation plantation owner whose father had claimed 600 acres back during the Mexican period. Caffrey ran what the locals called a moderate operation, 32 enslaved people working 300 acres of cotton, with timber sales bringing in extra income when the harvest fell short. His reputation marked him as practical, neither particularly brutal nor particularly merciful, the kind of owner who calculated every penny of profit and regarded his labor force with the same emotional investment he gave to his work animals. Caffrey's wife had succumbed to fever 2 years earlier, leaving him alone with a 19-year-old daughter named Catherine and a household that bore all the telltale signs of a widower's neglect. He maintained strict budgets, avoided the gambling tables and whiskey that destroyed other planners, attended the Methodist Church with the consistency of a man who genuinely believed that God rewarded discipline with material success. On the 14th of April, 1850, Caffrey rode into Marshall carrying $600 in banknotes. His intention was straightforward. Purchase 2 field hands to replace the workers he'd been forced to sell the previous autumn to cover debts from a disappointing harvest. The auction unfolded in the lot behind the Harrison County Courthouse, where a temporary wooden platform served as the selling block, and prospective buyers examined the merchandise with the practiced eyes of men who'd been evaluating human bodies since they were old enough to understand the value of flesh. Samuel Quincaid was designated as lot number 7. The auctioneer's description was brief and clinical. Mala Negro, approximately 28 years of age, trained for field work. No distinguishing marks or physical defects. Papers showing clean title from a New Orleans dealer. What those papers carefully failed to mention, because the New Orleans dealer had deliberately omitted this particular detail, was that Samuel had already been sold 4 times in the previous 2 years. And after each sale, his owner had died unexpectedly. Thomas Caffrey paid $420 for Samuel, a moderate price that suggested neither premium quality nor damaged goods. The bill of sale received the proper signatures, proper witnesses, proper recording in the county ledger, with the same bureaucratic precision that documented every commercial transaction that passed through Marshall. Samuel stepped down from that platform and followed his new owner to a wagon already loaded with supplies, displaying neither resistance nor any visible emotion whatsoever. The journey to the Caffrey plantation consumed 3 hours, following roads that gradually deteriorated from packed dirt to rutted trails as they pushed deeper into the piney woods. Caffrey spoke sparingly, offering only the essential information about work expectations and the layout of the slave quarters. Samuel responded when directly addressed, using the verbal patterns that were expected of him, keeping his eyes appropriately lowered. What Thomas Caffrey failed to notice, what perhaps no white man possessed the capacity to notice because the entire social order required them to remain blind to it, was the way Samuel absorbed everything. He studied the distance between the main house and the quarters, memorized the location of the overseer's cabin, noted the rhythm of the plantation's daily routine, observed the relationships between the other enslaved people, identified the places where authority was actively enforced versus the places where it simply assumed automatic compliance. Samuel received assignment to a cabin shared with 2 other field hands. They gave him a blanket and weekly rations of cornmeal and salt pork. The following morning, they put him to work in the cotton fields. Over the next 6 weeks, his behavior gave absolutely no one any cause for concern. He worked with steady consistency without being exceptional, spoke rarely, caused 0 disturbances. The overseer, a man named Wallace Pruitt, who'd worked for the Caffreys since before Thomas inherited the land, marked him down in his records as satisfactory but unremarkable. The other enslaved people, however, they noticed something that completely escaped the white men's attention. Samuel asked questions, not dangerous questions that challenged authority, but careful, methodical questions that mapped relationships and routines. He learned who held favor, who faced regular punishment, who had attempted escape, who had been broken by the system's cruelty. He discovered that Caffrey suffered from recurring headaches that left him bedridden for days at a time, that he consumed laudanum for the pain, that his daughter Catherine mixed his medicine and managed much of the household during his invalid hours. He learned that the Caffrey plantation operated on credit extended by Marshall merchants, that last year's harvest had barely covered existing debts, that Thomas Caffrey was essentially a man walking a financial tightrope who couldn't survive another poor season. On the night of June 2nd, 1850, Thomas Caffrey retired to his bedroom complaining of one of his recurring headaches. His daughter Catherine brought him his customary dose of laudanum dissolved in water, exactly as she'd done hundreds upon hundreds of times before. He drank it down, dismissed her with a wave, settled into his bed to wait for the medicine to do its work. By the time morning light crept through his window, Thomas Caffrey was dead. The discovery came at first light when Catherine knocked on her father's door with his breakfast and received only silence in response. The door was unlocked. It was always unlocked because who needs locked doors in their own house, protected by their own property, their own people? She found him lying in his bed on his back, eyes half open, his body already cooling in the morning air that carried the scent of pine resin through open windows. Catherine's scream brought the house servants running at full speed, and within minutes, Wallace Pruitt was dispatching a rider to Marshall to fetch Dr. Ambrose Whitfield. the only physician with formal training within 20 miles. The doctor arrived 3 hours later, his horse lathered from hard riding, and he conducted an examination that would later be recorded in his personal journal with unusual thoroughness. Patient discovered in state of rigor mortis, approximately 6 to 8 hours post-mortem, Whitfield wrote in his careful script. No evidence of violence inflicted upon the body. No unusual discoloration of the skin. No odor suggesting poisoning by common substances. Pupils fixed and dilated. Expression suggests neither pain nor fear, but rather the peaceful aspect of one who died in natural sleep. Upon questioning, the daughter learned that the deceased had consumed his usual evening dose of laudanum for chronic head pain. Empty medicine glass found on bedside table, unwashed. Cause of death appears to be sudden failure of heart or respiration, possibly triggered by apoplexy or some sudden internal rupture. Given patient's history of chronic head pain, suspect an underlying condition finally proved fatal. It was a perfectly reasonable conclusion for 1850 medicine, which understood precious little about sudden cardiac events and even less about the subtle ways a human body could be encouraged to simply stop functioning. Dr. Whitfield signed a death certificate listing natural causes, failure of constitution, and departed with his $5 fee, leaving behind a plantation suddenly thrown into chaos. The funeral took place 3 days later at the Methodist Church, with Thomas Caffrey buried in the churchyard alongside his late wife. Catherine, now orphaned and technically in control of the plantation but practically helpless under the legal restrictions that bound unmarried women, found herself entirely dependent on her father's executor, a martial attorney named Benjamin Hargrove, who'd handled the Caffrey family's legal affairs for 20 years. The plantation itself entered that peculiar state of limbo that always followed sudden death in the slaveholding class. Work continued because work had to continue. Cotton doesn't care about funerals, but the authority structure had been decapitated. Wallace Pruitt maintained day-to-day operations, but he lacked the authority to make financial decisions or purchase necessary supplies. Catherine could give orders to the household slaves, but the field operations remained firmly outside her proper sphere. Attorney Hargrove visited twice weekly, reviewing accounts and expenses, gradually arriving at the same conclusion that every creditor in Marshall had already reached. The Caffrey plantation was insolvent. 2 months after Thomas Caffrey's death, his entire estate was liquidated at public auction. The land went to a consortium of Marshall merchants settling their outstanding debts. The household furniture, the farm equipment, the livestock, all sold to the highest bidders, and 32 human beings stood on that courthouse auction block once again, including Samuel Quincaid, who had been on the Caffrey plantation for exactly 11 weeks. The second buyer called himself Robert Chandler. Chandler operated on a larger scale than Caffrey. 800 acres with 67 enslaved people, a 2-story house filled with imported furniture, and ambitions that matched his substantial income. He'd arrived in Texas from Alabama in 1847, bringing his slaves and his agricultural expertise with him, and he'd prospered sufficiently to begin wielding his opinions with weight in county politics. 42 years old, married with 3 children, a deacon at the Baptist church, a man who believed with absolute conviction that slavery was not merely profitable but morally ordained by Scripture itself. He paid $380 for Samuel, $40 less than Caffrey had paid because estate sales always went cheaper than market auctions, and transported him to a plantation that operated with military-like precision. Chandler ran what he called a rational system, detailed record-keeping for everything, scheduled punishments for infractions based on written rules, a firm belief that enslaved people would be maximally productive if managed with consistent, predictable discipline. He was neither a sadist nor a reformer, but rather a man who read the agricultural journals and believed true efficiency could be achieved through proper management techniques. Samuel arrived at the Chandler plantation on August 15, 1850, and received assignment to a work gang supervised by an overseer named Martin Yates, a man who'd been born into slavery himself before being granted freedom in his owner's will, and who now served the very system that had once claimed ownership over him. The bitter irony was lost on no one except possibly Chandler, who viewed Yates as living proof that the system worked perfectly. After all, hadn't he been rewarded for good service with his freedom? For 6 weeks, Samuel worked Chandler's fields, observed Chandler's routines, asked his careful, methodical questions. He learned that Chandler suffered from recurring digestive complaints that he treated with calomel, mercury chloride purchased from the same doctor who'd examined Thomas Caffrey's corpse. He learned that Chandler maintained meticulous ledgers documenting every expense and every source of income. Ledgers that revealed the plantation was profitable but heavily leveraged with substantial debts to New Orleans cotton factors. He learned that Chandler maintained a personal habit of inspecting the slave quarters every Sunday after church, searching for contraband, stolen goods, or any evidence of resistance to his authority. On the evening of September 28, 1850, Robert Chandler complained of stomach pains following dinner. His wife brought him a dose of his usual calomel medicine, prepared exactly as she'd prepared it dozens and dozens of times before. He swallowed it down, retired to his study to review his plantation ledgers. 4 hours later, they found him slumped over his desk, his skin showing a gray pallor that his wife would later describe as looking like he'd been drained of all his blood. Dr. Whitfield received the summons once again. He conducted another examination that would appear in his journal with slightly more concern than his previous entry. Patient discovered deceased at his desk. Approximate time of death 2 to 3 hours before discovery. Skin shows unusual pallor and slight yellowing of the eyes suggesting possible liver dysfunction. Known history of digestive complaints and regular use of calomel for treatment. Stomach contents expelled before death, visible in basin near desk. Death appears consistent with sudden organ failure, possibly related to chronic digestive condition. Mercury poisoning considered but dismissed as patient, had been taking calomel for years without incident. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution aggravated by chronic digestive disorder. The funeral took place at the Baptist church where Chandler had served as deacon. The estate entered probate proceedings, and 6 weeks later, the entire Chandler plantation was liquidated at auction, with Samuel Kincaid once again standing on that courthouse block, now carrying the peculiar distinction of being sold from 2 consecutive estates. The whispers started then. Quiet conversations between slaves at different plantations passed along the invisible communication network that connected every enslaved community throughout the county. Samuel Kincaid had been on 2 plantations. Both owners had died of natural causes within weeks of his arrival. It might mean nothing. It probably meant nothing, but people were beginning to notice. The third buyer was named Daniel Hartford, and with his purchase, the pattern became absolutely undeniable. Daniel Hartford operated on entirely different principles than his predecessors. A North Carolina transplant who'd arrived in Texas during the Republic period, Hartford ran what he called a Christian plantation, which meant he held prayer services for his slaves every Sunday, forbade any work on the Sabbath, believed that slavery represented a sacred trust that carried specific obligations of care. He didn't personally beat his slaves. He had his overseer handle that because discipline was necessary but shouldn't be administered in anger. He didn't separate families unless absolute economic necessity required it. He provided what he considered adequate food and clothing, by which he meant the bare minimum required to maintain working efficiency. Hartford's piety didn't extend much into his business practices, though. He owned 93 human beings across 1,000 acres, operated a cotton gin that processed crops for smaller plantations throughout the region, extended credit to neighboring farmers at interest rates that would make a Montgomery Street banker envious. He attended church 3 times weekly, quoted scripture in casual conversation, genuinely believed he was one of God's elect, destined for salvation while performing his earthly duty of managing what he considered inferior races. When Hartford purchased Samuel Kincaid for $350 on November 12, 1850, he'd already heard the rumors circulating. 2 previous owners, both dead, but Hartford believed in divine providence, not in superstition. If God had chosen to call those men home, who was he to question divine will? Besides, the price was favorable. The slave appeared healthy and capable. Hartford had never been the kind of man to let gossip influence sound business decisions. Samuel arrived at the Hartford plantation and received assignment to the cotton gin operation, work that required more skill than simple field labor and brought him into much closer proximity to the plantation's commercial operations. He worked alongside 15 other enslaved people who operated the machinery, processed the raw cotton, and loaded bales for transport to the Marshall Shipping Depot. Hartford himself spent 3 days each week at the gin, personally supervising operations and meeting with the small farmers who brought their crops for processing. He maintained a visible presence, a man who believed that personal oversight prevented theft and inefficiency. He also believed deeply in setting an example of proper Christian behavior, which meant he abstained from alcohol, avoided gambling, didn't consort with women other than his wife, and maintained what he considered a morally clean household. What Hartford didn't know, what his piety prevented him from seeing, was that his clean household depended entirely on the enslaved woman who prepared every single one of his meals. Her name was Rachel. She'd worked in the Hartford kitchen for 12 years, ever since being purchased as a teenager from an estate sale in Louisiana. She prepared every meal, measured every ingredient, maintained the food stores with the efficiency of someone who understood that any mistake, any error, would bring immediate punishment. Rachel noticed when Samuel started asking questions about the household routines. She noticed when he inquired about Mr. Hartford's habits, his health, his daily schedule. And she noticed, though she said absolutely nothing about it, when Samuel began volunteering to help in the kitchen garden, learning which herbs were used for cooking and which were kept exclusively for medicinal purposes. On January 7th, 1851, Daniel Hartford consumed his usual breakfast of eggs, ham, grits, and coffee. He attended to business in his office, reviewing accounts and meeting with a small farmer regarding a crop loan. He ate his usual lunch of cold meat and bread. At approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon, while discussing a cotton shipment with his overseer, he collapsed. The overseer's description, given later to Dr. Whitfield, noted that Hartford had seemed perfectly fine one moment, and then suddenly couldn't catch his breath. His face turned red, then purple. He clutched desperately at his chest, gasped out something that might have been a prayer, and fell to the ground. By the time they carried him to the house and sent for the doctor, Daniel Hartford was dead, his face still showing that purple discoloration that suggested he'd suffocated while his heart continued beating. Dr. Whitfield's journal entry for that day shows his first real seeds of concern. Third patient in 8 months. All plantation owners. All sudden deaths with no clear cause. Hartford showed signs of acute respiratory failure, possibly cardiac in origin, but the sudden onset and rapid progression suggests something far more than natural disease. Patient had no history of heart trouble, no recent illness, no explanation for sudden collapse. Examined food stores thoroughly and found nothing suspicious. Questioned kitchen staff extensively and received no useful information. Cannot shake the feeling that something is profoundly wrong here, but cannot identify what. Cause of death recorded as failure of constitution, sudden origin. The funeral took place at Hartford's church, where his fellow deacons eulogized him as a man taken far too soon by God's mysterious plan. His widow was left with 3 children under the age of 10 and a plantation she couldn't legally operate under any circumstances. The estate entered probate, and Samuel Quincaid was sold once again, this time to a buyer who'd specifically sought him out. His name was James Whitlock, and he didn't believe in coincidence. Whitlock operated differently from the previous buyers. 10 years younger, Texas-born, educated at a military academy in Virginia. He'd returned home determined to build his own plantation through calculated risk and careful management. He owned fewer slaves than Hartford, only 42, but he ran his operation with the precision of a former soldier, keeping detailed records of every single aspect of plantation life, including the health, behavior, and productivity of every person he claimed ownership over. When Whitlock heard that the Hartford estate was liquidating, he made quiet inquiries. When he learned that Samuel Quincaid was being sold from his 3rd consecutive estate, he became genuinely interested. When he discovered that all 3 previous owners had died of natural causes within weeks of purchasing Samuel, he became absolutely fascinated. On February 3, 1851, James Whitlock paid $275 for Samuel Quincaid, a notably low price that reflected the growing whispers about bad luck and worse possibilities, and transported him to a plantation that operated under what Whitlock called strict observation protocols. Samuel was given his own isolated cabin, separated from the other enslaved people. His food was prepared separately and delivered by Whitlock's personal servant. His work assignments kept him visible and accounted for throughout every single daylight hour. Whitlock himself made a point of speaking with Samuel daily, asking questions, observing responses, looking for any sign, any indication of the threat he believed existed. "You've had unfortunate luck with your previous owners," Whitlock said during their first conversation. standing outside Samuel's cabin while armed overseers waited nearby. 3 men dead. Some might call that a pattern. Samuel kept his eyes lowered, his voice carefully neutral. Don't know nothing about that, master. Just worked where I was told to work, and yet they all died. Caffrey, Chandler, Hartford, all within weeks of purchasing you. All of sudden illness that the doctor couldn't properly explain. Whitlock paused, studying Samuel's face intently for any reaction whatsoever. You know what I think? I think you're either the unluckiest slave in all of Texas, or the most dangerous. Just trying to do my work, master. Don't want no trouble. Good. Because I'm watching you, Samuel. Every hour of every day you're being watched. If you sneeze wrong, I'll know about it. If you so much as look at someone sideways, I'll know. And if anything happens to me, Whitlock leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. If anything happens to me, they won't wait for any trial. They'll hang you from the nearest tree and ask questions later. Do you understand? Yes, master. Whitlock straightened, satisfied that he'd made his point clear. He'd put the slave on notice, established his authority, created a surveillance system that would catch any suspicious behavior. It was a rational approach to what seemed like an irrational problem. The sort of military thinking that had served him well at the academy. It didn't save his life. For 11 weeks, Samuel worked under constant, unrelenting observation. He performed his assigned tasks. Carpentry work on a new barn, repairs to the slave quarters, general maintenance around the plantation. He ate food prepared separately from the general kitchen. He slept alone in his cabin with an overseer posted outside. He gave Whitlock absolutely no reason for complaint and zero evidence of any wrongdoing, but Whitlock himself began to change. The stress of constant vigilance wore at him like water on stone. He slept poorly, started at unexpected sounds, found himself checking and rechecking his food before eating. His wife noticed that he'd grown paranoid, jumping at shadows, making wild accusations against servants who'd worked faithfully for years. His overseer noted in his daily reports that Whitlock seemed nervous and agitated, not himself, like a man expecting attack at any moment. On April 19, 1851, James Whitlock dismissed his food taster, a young enslaved boy he'd specifically recruited for that purpose, after deciding that the constant surveillance was making him look foolish in front of everyone. He ate dinner with his wife and children, retired to his study to review accounts, spent 2 hours working on his detailed plantation records. At approximately 10 o'clock that evening, Whitlock's wife heard a crash from the study. She found her husband on the floor, convulsing violently, his eyes rolled back in his head, foam gathering at his mouth. He died before she could summon any help, his body still twitching with what the doctor would later describe as symptoms consistent with epileptic seizure or possible poisoning, though the patient had no history of seizures and no evidence of poison could be identified. Dr. Whitfield's journal entry that night marks a genuine turning point. 4th death in less than 1 year, all connected to the same enslaved man. This cannot be coincidence. This cannot be natural disease. Something is happening here that I cannot explain through any medical knowledge I possess. Have examined the body thoroughly, found no evidence of poison or violence. Have questioned all household staff extensively, discovered nothing suspicious, and yet the patient is dead. And Samuel Quincaid remains alive and apparently healthy. I no longer know what I'm looking at. I no longer know if I'm witnessing murder or witnessing some kind of curse that I don't understand. All I know is that recommending legal action against a slave without concrete evidence would be professional suicide. And yet doing nothing seems equally impossible. Have recorded cause of death as sudden seizure of unknown origin. May God forgive me if I'm wrong. The estate was liquidated. Samuel was sold again. And the whispers that had started as quiet speculation became open talk throughout the slave communities of 3 counties. Samuel Quincaid could not be owned. Samuel Quincaid killed his masters without ever touching them. Samuel Quincaid was death itself, walking through the plantation system like divine vengeance disguised as property. The 5th buyer was a man named George Pruitt, no relation to Wallace Pruitt, the Caffrey overseer. He bought Samuel for $150 despite the warnings, despite the obvious pattern, despite everyone telling him he was purchasing his own death. Pruitt was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, or so deep in debt that he simply didn't care anymore, needing cheap labor regardless of the ultimate cost. He lasted 6 weeks before dying of what Dr. Whitfield recorded as acute respiratory distress following sudden onset of symptoms consistent with pneumonia, though the patient showed absolutely no signs of illness prior to his collapse. The sixth buyer, Nathan Cross, paid $90 for Samuel and died 3 weeks later from what the doctor called paralysis of unknown origin, beginning in the extremities and progressing to vital organs with unusual rapidity. And the seventh buyer, William Stokes, the last man who would ever purchase Samuel Quincaid, paid $65 for a slave that everyone in the entire county knew carried death with him like a shadow. Just when we thought we'd witnessed everything this story had to offer, the horror in eastern Texas intensifies even further. If this story is sending chills down your spine right now, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content. And don't forget to subscribe to The Sealed Room to never miss stories exactly like this one. Let's discover together what happens next, because William Stokes would do something that none of the previous owners had managed. He would live long enough to ask Samuel Quincaid directly, face to face, how he'd accomplished it all. William Stokes was dying anyway. At 58 years old, the former Georgia planter had come to Texas in 1849 with his wife, 3 adult children, and 17 enslaved people, hoping to rebuild a fortune lost to bad cotton prices and even worse investments. He'd purchased a marginal property 40 miles south of Marshall in Cherokee County, where the soil wasn't quite rich enough for quality cotton, and the timber had already been logged out by previous owners. He'd struggled through 2 years of inadequate harvests, watched his children abandon him for better prospects in New Orleans, seen his wife waste away from consumption until she died in the spring of 1851. By August of that year, when he heard about a slave being sold cheap in Marshall because of rumors that nobody sensible believed, William Stokes knew he had maybe 6 months before the creditors foreclosed on his worthless land. He knew his own body was failing. The cough that wouldn't quit, the weight he couldn't keep on no matter what he ate, the exhaustion that made every single day feel like climbing a mountain. He knew he was going to die on his worthless land, alone, having failed at everything that had ever mattered to him. So when the auctioneer in Marshall offered him a healthy field hand for $65, less than a quarter the normal price, William Stokes bought Samuel Quincaid, took him back to Cherokee County, and did something that none of the previous owners had ever considered. He asked questions. Not the threatening questions that Whitlock had asked. Not the suspicious interrogations that assumed guilt from the beginning. Instead, on their third evening together, sitting on the porch of a house that was literally falling apart around them, Stokes offered Samuel a cup of coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute that most slaves received. And he spoke to him like a human being. "You've killed 6 men," Stokes said, his voice matter-of-fact, carrying no anger or accusation. "I know it. You know it. Every slave in 3 counties knows it. What I can't figure out is how." Samuel sat silent, the coffee cup warm in his hands, calculating whether this was just another trap. "I'm dying anyway," Stokes continued, staring out at fields that had gone completely to weed. "Got maybe 6 months before the consumption takes me, or the bank does, whichever comes first. So I'm not afraid of you. I'm curious." He turned to look at Samuel directly. "How did you do it?" The silence stretched between them, filled only with the sounds of cicadas and the distant howl of a dog somewhere in the darkness. Then Samuel spoke, his voice shedding the dialect he'd so carefully maintained for 18 months. "You really want to know? I really do, and if I tell you, you'll have me hanged." Stokes laughed, a wet sound that turned into a coughing fit. When he recovered, he shook his head. "Boy, I'll be dead before any trial could possibly happen. And even if I wasn't, who's going to believe a dying man's confession? They'd say the consumption had rotted my brain." He took a sip of his coffee. "So tell me, how does a slave kill 6 owners without anyone catching him?" Samuel studied the old man's face carefully, looking for the trap, the trick, the betrayal that his entire life had taught him to expect. He found only exhaustion and genuine curiosity from a man who had absolutely nothing left to lose. "You don't poison them," Samuel said quietly. "That's what everyone thinks. That's what everyone assumes. But poison leaves traces. The doctor examines the body, finds evidence. And then you hang. You don't hurt them physically because that leaves marks. You don't steal because they check your cabin. You don't run because that admits guilt." He paused, choosing his words with extreme care. "What you do is make them afraid." "Afraid of what?" Of you, of death, of the thing they think you might do. Samuel's voice carried a tone that hadn't been there before. Something cold and analytical. Thomas Caffrey had headaches. Everyone knew it. Took laudanum every single night. Same dose, same time, like clockwork. I didn't touch his medicine. Not once. I just asked questions. Careful questions about his headaches, about his symptoms, about how bad they'd gotten over the years. Asked the house servants, asked the other field hands. Made absolutely sure those questions would get back to him. Like I was studying him, learning about his weakness, and he started thinking about dying. Started worrying that the next headache might be the one that killed him. Started examining every symptom, every little pain, wondering if this was the beginning of the end. Samuel's eyes stayed fixed on something in the far distance. He took his usual laudanum that night, but he also took extra. Because he was scared. Because the headache was worse than usual. Because fear makes pain worse. Everyone knows that. Took enough to stop his heart in his sleep. Stokes absorbed this, his expression unreadable. You killed him with his own fear. I made him aware of what was already killing him. The laudanum addiction. The headaches that got worse every month. The dose he kept increasing because the pain kept growing. He would have died anyway. Maybe in a year, maybe 2. I just made him die sooner. On my schedule, Chandler. Same principle, different method. He took calomel for his stomach. Mercury medicine that was slowly poisoning him anyway. Everyone takes it. Nobody thinks about what it does over time, how it accumulates. I just made him aware of his symptoms. Made him think about organ failure. Made him scared enough to take extra doses when the pain got worse. Samuel's voice remained flat. Clinical fear causes stress. Stress causes stomach problems. Stomach problems make you take more medicine. Medicine kills you. I just started the wheel spinning. Hartford. Hartford was harder. He didn't have an obvious weakness. Didn't take medicine regularly, but he was pious. Believed deeply in God's judgment. Believed in sin and punishment and divine retribution. So I let him see things that made him question his own righteousness. Small things. A conversation he overheard about slaves discussing Judgment Day. A Bible verse left open in his office to passages about false prophets and hypocrites. Questions asked about whether slavery was truly Christian. Asked where he'd hear them, but never directly to him. Samuel paused, made him doubt himself. Made him question his salvation. Made him start seeing signs of God's displeasure everywhere he looked. The stress triggered his heart. Not poison, not violence. Just fear eating him alive from the inside. Stokes sat quietly, processing everything he was hearing. The others? Whitlock was easy. He was already paranoid from the beginning. Just had to feed that paranoia, make him see threats everywhere. Keep him in a constant state of alert until his body broke down from the stress. Pruitt and Cross were variations on the same theme. Find the weakness. Make them conscious of it. Let their own fear do all the work. Samuel finally turned to look at Stokes directly. Fear is the most powerful poison there is. It doesn't leave traces. It doesn't need a weapon. It just needs someone who's already sick, already dying, already carrying the thing that will eventually kill them. All you have to do is make them see it clearly. The silence that followed was broken only by Stokes's ragged breathing. Finally, the old man nodded slowly. You're not a murderer, he said. You're something worse. You're a mirror. You show men what's already killing them and let them finish the job themselves. I'm a slave who refuses to be owned, Samuel replied. That's all I've ever been. And now you're here on my worthless land, waiting for me to die of consumption so you can be sold again. Stokes laughed again, that wet, terrible sound. Except I'm not going to die that way. Samuel's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air between them. I'm going to free you, Stokes said. Tomorrow I'm going to take you to Jefferson. Get the papers drawn up properly. Manumit you legally. Let you walk out of here a free man before I die, and my creditors seize every single asset I own. He stood up, joints cracking, supporting himself on the porch railing. You want to know why? Because what you did, it's the most brilliant revenge I've ever heard of. You turned the system against itself, used their own weapons, their own medicine, their own fears, and you made them kill themselves while looking guilty of absolutely nothing. They'll never let me stay free, Samuel said. Free black man in Texas with no papers proving how he got that way? They'll sell me back into slavery within a month. Then you go north. Get to Mexico. Get to a free state. Get somewhere they can't touch you. Stokes turned to go inside, then paused. You know what the real horror is? It's not that you killed 6 men. It's that you proved slavery can't actually work. Can't really own a man who's smarter than you. Can't really control someone who understands your weakness better than you understand it yourself. You're proof that the whole system is built on sand. He went inside, leaving Samuel on that porch with his coffee, and went to bed for the last time. William Stokes died 3 days later, before he could make the trip to Jefferson to file those manumission papers. He died of consumption, exactly as everyone expected, his body finally giving up after months and months of deterioration. His death was not mysterious, not suspicious, not anything but the natural progression of a disease that had been killing him since long before he'd ever heard the name Samuel Kincaid. But what happened next revealed something that the previous 7 deaths had completely obscured: the true scope of Samuel's plan, and the reason he'd never attempted to escape despite having multiple opportunities when the Stokes estate was liquidated, a process that took less than a week given how little value remained. The county sheriff discovered something highly unusual in the property records. William Stokes had drafted a will 3 days before his death, a document that left everything to his creditors except for one specific item. Samuel Kincaid was to be freed upon Stokes's death, with papers filed in Jefferson confirming his status as a free man of color. The problem was that Stokes had died before signing that document in front of proper witnesses. Under Texas law, an unsigned will carried absolutely no legal weight. Samuel remained property subject to seizure and sale like any other asset. The sheriff, a man named Douglas Kimball, who'd served in that role since 1848, found himself facing a peculiar dilemma. He had an enslaved man who'd been present at 7 consecutive owner deaths, a pattern that everyone acknowledged but no one could prove meant anything. He had a dead man's unsigned will suggesting that the deceased had intended to free this particular slave. And he had a growing sense that something was profoundly wrong about this entire situation. Kimball did what any sensible lawman would do. He locked Samuel in the Marshall jail while he investigated. The investigation lasted 2 weeks and uncovered absolutely nothing criminal, but everything suspicious. Kimball interviewed Dr. Whitfield, who admitted his concerns, but acknowledged he had no evidence of wrongdoing. He interviewed the widows of the deceased men, who shared their suspicions but could provide no proof whatsoever. He interviewed the overseers, the other enslaved people, the merchants who'd done business with the dead men. What emerged was a portrait of improbable coincidence stretched to its absolute breaking point. 7 men, all dead of natural causes, all within weeks of purchasing the same slave. 7 estates liquidated, 7 families disrupted, 7 fortunes scattered. And 1 man, Samuel Kincaid, who remained healthy and apparently innocent of everything except being present when death came calling. The legal problem was simple. Texas law recognized no crime in what Samuel had done because Texas law couldn't prove he'd done anything at all. He'd raised no weapon, administered no poison, committed no violence. The fact that 7 men had died after purchasing him was, legally speaking, coincidence. Unfortunate, suspicious, but not criminal. The social problem was far more complex. The white community of Harrison County found itself facing an uncomfortable truth. They had no mechanism to address a threat they couldn't prove existed. If Samuel was guilty, he was guilty of exploiting the very system designed to control him. If he was innocent, then 7 men had died of random chance so improbable that it defied all statistical possibility. Either way, absolutely no one wanted to buy him. The auction held on September 15th, 1851, attracted exactly 3 bidders. All of them land speculators hoping to resell him farther west where his reputation hadn't spread yet. The winning bid was $42, less than the cost of a good mule, from a dealer named Thompson who planned to transport him to San Antonio, where nobody knew his history. But on the morning Samuel was scheduled to be transferred, something unexpected happened that would seal his fate and reveal the final piece of his design. A delegation of enslaved people from 7 different plantations appeared at the Marshall courthouse, asking to speak with Sheriff Kimball. It was unprecedented, slaves approaching white authority directly, requesting an audience, acting as if they had rights to petition. The sheriff considered having them whipped for their presumption, but something in their manner suggested this was important enough to hear. What they told him changed. Everything. The delegation spokesman was a man named Daniel who'd worked the Chandler plantation and had known Samuel during his brief time there. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing words that wouldn't implicate himself or others, but making absolutely clear that the enslaved community knew things the white community didn't. "Samuel Kincaid ain't killing nobody," Daniel said, his eyes properly lowered, his tone respectful. "He ain't poisoning. He ain't hurting. He ain't doing nothing you could hang him for. But he's teaching." "Teaching what?" Kimball asked. "Teaching us how they dying anyway. Teaching us how to see what's already there, what's already killing them, the medicine they take, the food they eat, the stress they carry. Teaching us how to notice, how to ask questions, how to make them see what they already dying from." Daniel's voice remained steady, but there was something underneath it. Pride, maybe, or satisfaction. He ain't creating nothing new. He's just showing us what's always been there. Kimball absorbed this, understanding the full implications immediately. He's training other slaves to do what he does. He's teaching us to survive by knowing our owners better than they know themselves. Teaching us to see their weaknesses, understand their fears, recognize what's killing them before they do. Daniel met the sheriff's eyes briefly before lowering his gaze again. "We ain't criminals, Sheriff. We just paying attention to the men who own us. Ain't nothing illegal about that." The sheriff sat silent, realizing that the threat wasn't Samuel Kincaid individually. It was what he represented and what he was spreading. The knowledge that enslaved people could study their owners, understand their vulnerabilities, use that knowledge to survive longer than any individual owner lived. It wasn't murder. It was evolution within bondage. Kimball made his decision that afternoon. He declared Samuel Kincaid to be a threat to public order, based not on criminal evidence but on the potential for slave rebellion through what he termed psychological manipulation. He ordered Samuel held in jail indefinitely without trial, under authority granted to sheriffs for maintaining public safety. It was illegal, unconstitutional, completely outside Kimball's legitimate powers. It was also the only solution anyone could devise. Samuel Kincaid spent the next 3 years in the Marshall jail, held without charge, without trial, without any legal proceeding whatsoever. The county paid for his upkeep through a special assessment that everyone understood was cheaper than letting him back into circulation. He was neither slave nor free, neither criminal nor innocent, but rather an anomaly that the system couldn't process through normal channels. And then the war came. The Civil War reached Marshall slowly, more as economic disruption than military threat. The town was too far from the major battlefields to see actual combat, but it felt the war's effects through conscription, through inflation, through the gradual collapse of the plantation economy that had sustained it. Cotton prices rose dramatically, then crashed. Currency became worthless. The Confederate government requisitioned supplies, slaves' equipment, and in February 1863, with Union victories mounting and the Confederacy growing desperate for any advantage, someone in Richmond remembered a jail in Marshall, Texas that held an unusual prisoner. The letter arrived via military courier, addressed to Sheriff Kimball, bearing the official seal of the Confederate War Department. It requested, which meant it ordered, the transfer of Samuel Kincaid to Richmond for consultation on matters of military intelligence relating to enemy psychological operations. Kimball understood the real meaning immediately. The Confederacy wanted to know if Samuel's methods could be weaponized. If one man could eliminate 7 slave owners through psychological manipulation, could that technique be taught to Confederate agents operating behind Union lines? Could it be used against Union officers, Northern politicians? Anyone the Confederacy needed eliminated without leaving evidence? The sheriff wrote back refusing the transfer, citing public safety concerns. Richmond replied with a direct order from the Secretary of War himself. Kimball wrote again, this time detailing exactly what Samuel had done and why releasing him would be dangerous even to the Confederacy. Richmond's response arrived 3 weeks later. They didn't care about the details. They needed the weapon. On March 15, 1863, Samuel Kincaid was released from the Marshall jail into Confederate custody. He was transported east under military guard, carried by wagon and rail through a Confederacy already showing unmistakable signs of collapse. By the time he reached Richmond in early April, Union forces were tightening their grip on the Mississippi River, and the Confederacy's days were clearly numbered. What happened in Richmond was never officially recorded, but pieces can be reconstructed from letters, from diaries, from scattered references in Confederate documents. Samuel was interviewed by intelligence officers, questioned about his methods. Asked to explain his techniques in meticulous detail, he was cooperative, articulate, apparently truthful, which made his information completely useless for Confederate purposes, because what Samuel told them was that his methods required intimate knowledge of individual targets, long periods of careful observation, circumstances that allowed him to manipulate victims' existing conditions. He couldn't teach Confederate agents to do what he'd done because what he'd done depended on being property, being present in owners' homes, being trusted enough to be invisible. He'd exploited specific vulnerabilities in specific men using information gathered over weeks or months of patient observation. You couldn't turn that into a weapon of war. You couldn't train agents to deploy it against enemy officers. It wasn't an assassination technique. It was survival through patient understanding of the system that enslaved him. The Confederate intelligence officers realized they'd been sent a philosophical problem disguised as a tactical asset. They couldn't use Samuel Quincaid, couldn't replicate his methods, couldn't weaponize what he'd accomplished. All they could do was acknowledge that he'd proven something the Confederacy depended on denying: that enslaved people were capable of understanding and defeating their enslavers through intellect alone. They released him in Richmond on April 23, 1863, giving him papers identifying him as free and warning him that if he was caught in Confederate territory again, he'd be sold back into slavery immediately. Samuel walked out of Richmond carrying those papers and nothing else. The city was already showing signs of the siege that would eventually fall upon it, food shortages and inflation making daily life increasingly desperate. He had no money, no resources, no connections, but he had what he'd always had: intelligence, patience, and the ability to understand people better than they understood themselves. The historical record loses track of Samuel Quincaid after Richmond. There are no further legal documents bearing his name. No bills of sale, no arrest records, no death certificate. He vanished into the chaos of the Civil War's final 2 years. A ghost who'd proven that the peculiar institution could be defeated one owner at a time through nothing more than careful observation and the weaponization of fear. But his legacy survived. After the war, when Reconstruction brought federal troops and Freedmen's Bureau agents to Texas, a curious pattern emerged in the counties around Marshall. Former slaves, now freedmen, began demonstrating an unusual understanding of their former owners' businesses, debts, and vulnerabilities. They knew which plantations were bankrupted, which former slaveholders were desperate, which white families could be leveraged or negotiated with. They knew because they'd been taught to pay attention, taught to observe, taught to understand that survival meant knowing your enemy better than they knew themselves. And though Samuel Quincaid's name never appeared in the teaching, his methods had spread through the slave communities like a virus, passed quietly from plantation to plantation, from person to person, fundamentally changing how enslaved people understood their relationship with power. The Freedmen's Bureau records from Harrison County, preserved in the National Archives, contain dozens upon dozens of cases where formerly enslaved people successfully negotiated for land, for wages, for compensation by demonstrating detailed knowledge of their former owners' financial situations. They knew about hidden debts, about property mortgages, about business partnerships that had soured. They knew because they'd been watching, listening, understanding, not as property, but as intelligent observers trapped in an unjust system. One particularly detailed case from 1866 involved a freedman named Isaac who'd worked the Chandler plantation. When the former overseer tried to cheat him out of promised wages, Isaac produced a complete accounting of the plantation's finances for the previous 5 years, including crop yields, sales prices, outstanding debts. He'd memorized it all, piece by piece, year by year, waiting for the moment when that knowledge would become useful. The overseer, confronted with information he thought had been safely hidden in ledgers that illiterate slaves couldn't possibly read, was forced to pay. Isaac later told the bureau agent that he'd learned the importance of attention from a man who passed through once, who showed us that knowing was surviving. The white community of Marshall struggled to adapt to this new reality, where their former property possessed intimate knowledge of their vulnerabilities. Some former slaveholders abandoned their land entirely, unable to negotiate with people who understood their desperation too well. Others adapted, recognizing that the freed men they'd once owned were now partners in an economy that had collapsed and desperately needed rebuilding. But all of them learned that the relationship between enslaved and enslaver had never been as one-sided as they'd believed. The county records from that period show a dramatic increase in land transfers, in contract disputes, in negotiations where freedmen held unexpected leverage. Some of this was simple economics. The collapse of the plantation system left everyone scrambling for survival. But much of it reflected a shift in power dynamics that the former slaveholders found deeply unsettling. The people they'd considered property had always been studying them, understanding them, waiting for the moment when that understanding could be used. In 1868, a traveling journalist from Philadelphia visited Marshall while documenting Reconstruction in Texas. His articles, published in several northern newspapers, noted the peculiar sophistication of the freedmen in Harrison County, describing them as more knowledgeable about their former masters' affairs than would be expected from people who were supposedly kept in ignorance. He interviewed several freedmen who spoke carefully about the importance of observation, about learning to read people instead of books, about survival through understanding. None mentioned Samuel Quincaid by name, but the journalist noted that several referred to a teacher who came through during the war years, who showed them that seeing was as powerful as reading. The journalist also interviewed former slaveholders, recording their complaints about uppity freedmen who knew too much about private business affairs. One former plantation owner, who refused to be named, told the journalist, "We thought we controlled everything because we controlled their bodies. But we never realized they were controlling information we didn't even know they could access. They knew our debts, our fears, our weaknesses. They were always watching, always learning, and we were too blind to see it." Dr. Ambrose Whitfield lived until 1874, dying of natural causes at age 67. His journal, discovered after his death, contained a final entry dated September 1851 that read, "I have concluded that what happened with Samuel Quincaid was not murder in any legal sense, but rather something far more disturbing. A demonstration that the enslaved understand their enslavers better than we understand ourselves. This knowledge cannot be unlearned. This understanding cannot be erased, and I fear that future generations will discover what it truly means when the observed become more knowledgeable than the observers." But Whitfield also wrote something else in those final pages, a passage that suggests he'd come to understand the full scope of what Samuel had actually accomplished. The true horror of the Quincaid case was never about the death of 7 men. It was about the awakening of consciousness among people we'd convinced ourselves lacked the capacity for such sophistication. Every slave who learned to watch, to listen, to understand their owner's vulnerabilities, they all became potential threats to a system that depended entirely on assumed superiority. Samuel Quincaid didn't just kill his owners. He killed the illusion that slavery was sustainable in the presence of intelligent resistance. And that knowledge, once spread, can never be contained again. The 7 widows, those who survived the war and Reconstruction, lived to see slavery ended and their fortunes scattered. Some remarried, some moved away, some lived out their lives in reduced circumstances. None ever publicly acknowledged that their husbands might have been eliminated rather than simply unlucky. To do so would be to admit that the system they'd depended on was vulnerable in ways they'd never imagined. Catherine Caffrey, Thomas Caffrey's daughter, married a Union officer during Reconstruction and moved to Ohio, where she lived until 1889. In a letter to her cousin written in 1873, discovered in a family archive in Cincinnati, she wrote, "I sometimes think about the slave father purchased that spring, the one who was there when father died. I've read enough now, learned enough about medicine and psychology to understand what might have happened. Father's laudanum addiction was killing him slowly. Perhaps that man simply made him aware of it. Perhaps he did nothing at all except exist as a reminder of mortality. I'll never know, but I think about it often, about how we convinced ourselves we were superior while being so terribly, vulnerably human." Sheriff